Well, hello and welcome to Work Cookie, our weekly gathering of IO's, HR's recruiters and an actor or two as we try to make the world of work just a little bit better. And LindaAnn, we're going to continue our discussion this month, and we're going to talk today about future-proofing your culture, keeping the soul alive as you scale. And we've been going through this process this month about organizations scaling and growing, and it usually starts off really well. It's a bunch of guys that get together and they come together and they go, let's do something. Um, there's a great commercial up here in Canada about a group of friends who got together and started their own business because they didn't like men's underwear. They didn't like the way, it fit and the way it, as they say, looked after the boys. So they all got together and they started a company. It's doing incredibly well, but I imagine as they upscale, all of a sudden those friends are going to get pulled in different directions. All of a sudden the unity of the organization might not be as cohesive as it once was. And then you're bringing in new people who have different ideas. So how do you keep that spirit alive as you scale up?
So it's interesting as a consultant, you have basic knowledge and information and so forth, but until you have a challenge, you don't necessarily really dig into it as deeply as you would otherwise. And so this has been I really enjoyed this topic for this month, and I really enjoyed this particular one because it's such a challenge that so many companies face. Um, and one of the things that's important, I think, that as we talk about this is, people want to maintain the soul of their culture, but they don't have you have to identify what it is when you want to maintain it, right?
Right.
And so it's important to think about what is that the soul of the company, and basically it's an intangible essence that people have, this feeling that they have when they're in that early stage of a company. And for some people it's not as easy to verbalize as they would think, right? It's often not. It's just this, I know what it is, but and I know when it's not there, but those kinds of things. And so it's important to identify what that soul is for you, and also is, as the entrepreneur, what you think that soul is that what the people think is the soul of the culture, right? And make sure you get on the same page there. And so in thinking about this and using some of the references, which I'll post in a minute, um, is like Kevin Oakes from Culture of Innovation says, is a company's soul is found at the intersection of its purpose, values, and the lived experiences of its people. And as I dug into this, it's really important to realize that you need this thread. If you're going to scale your culture, you need a thread to pull it through the evolutions that you're going to go through as you scale. And so your culture is really tied to your values and your purpose, or your vision, however you want to see that. And when you, and one of the things that has made me tackle this is because I'm experiencing that with one of my clients. And so I asked him what pieces, what does he define as the culture that he wanted to maintain? And as he defined that, it was very, very clearly based in all the values and the vision that we had identified and they have been working on to maintain alignment with. And so when he defined that, it was a perfect definition, so that now we can communicate that as part of an onboarding orientation process. We can put it in the handbook or whatever that reiterates it for people. I use all of those things every time we do a strategic update. Those, the mission, the values, the vision, and now this cultural statement is now part of that process. So it's a constant reminder going forward of how we want to be as an organization, right?
Right.
Because if you can't communicate it, then it just goes away and it becomes part of that hope strategy that that many businesses institute, that we hope we can just maintain this as we scale. We hope this is going to work for whatever. And so with that, I'm going to see if anybody has any comments and questions on that, and I'll post the resources in the what do you call that?
Chat. All right. Well, I see Dr. Emery, you already got your hand up, so let's go to you.
Hello, LindaAnn. Thank you so much for this topic. I think the word like soul and spirit, when we talk about organizations, really speaks to like the wholeness of the purpose or the wholeness of what your product is or your service, whatever it is. And I loved some of the comments that you made, because vision is not a destination, and the word vision has really come to me a lot in the last few weeks. So I just loved hearing that as part of this. It's not a destination. It's like, hey, we're going to get there and then we're done, right? So the purpose of the organization is perpetual, right? And then if your purpose is done, then your organization is done. So understanding that vision is not like an end point is a really important thing, I think, for leaders to understand. And the clarity of the intention that shapes every step of that journey is in the vision, right? So the vision produces kind of the roadmap, if you will, for the journey that you're going to be taking. And this journey may be never ending. It may end in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And we don't necessarily know that at the onset, but the vision, I think, provides that clarity in the step there. And so I think one of the things LindaAnn mentioned there is really the thread. So it is the thread, the connective thread between our purpose and the progress that we're making in the purpose or towards that purpose. And I think one of the things that leaders need to be mindful of is making sure that that growth and that progress doesn't come at the cost of their identity. And so when you think about what is the identity of the organization, I think seeing vision as kind of a living system. It's not like the poster on the wall that makes you feel good. It's not it's not really the message, right? We have vision, mission. It's not just the message, but it is the way that we live and the way that we want to teach people within the organization to live, and really the guiding direction at the end of the day. And I think one of the things that's really important to me is making sure that adaptability is also purpose driven. And so as you scale, as you change, that there is purpose behind why. And experimentation is something I love to teach the teams that I work with. I think it's something that in the tech space is a little more accepted than some of the other arenas. So you have to kind of balance how risk averse are you when you're adapting. But every adaptation that you make, every change that you make, and every thing that you try needs to be done with purpose or for purpose. And the vision is really the vehicle or the driving force behind all of that.
Well, let me ask you this, because I love all this stuff, but, I'm an actor. So as soon as, LindaAnn started with, let's talk about how you feel, I was there. But, there's that other side of my brain that goes, but our purpose is to be profitable. And maybe some of this feel good stuff is feel good stuff, but we could be more profitable, especially, the term maximizing profitability. That is something that's come up like in the last decade. We just wanted to be profitable in the past. Now it's about maximizing profitability. So how do I talk to that half of my brain?
Right. Yeah, I really challenge that. And here's what I mean by that, right? So I challenge that because being profitable is a purpose that you can achieve in many different ways. And so why are you picking the route that you're at? The purpose of the route you're on or the journey you're on cannot just be profitable. Now, money's talks, I get it. Money bags are really attractive. I think about Mr. Krabs on SpongeBob, and he's got these like money signs on his eyes when he thinks about what he's doing, right? And so fine, I know it speaks to us, and it is a purpose, but it shouldn't really be the sole purpose, because why are you doing the product you're doing if you don't have passion about it or you don't believe in it? If you want just the money, then there's plenty of other investments you can make. You can go into stock market. You can go and probably run a really profitable franchise of McDonald's and whatever it is, right? If you just want money, there are many ways to achieve it. If you believe in your product, the purpose is not only the money. And so I challenge that to say, okay, what other purpose outside of being profitable is there underlying why on earth you're doing this organization or producing this product or giving this service in the world?
Thank you very much for that. Nick, let's go over to you.
Yeah, it's been the interesting conundrum, because there's that inflection point in growth where all of a sudden you have to change, you have to adapt, you have to incorporate new strategies. And I think to LindaAnn's point, we expect people would think about it and have a central purpose. And sometimes success just gets away from you, and all of a sudden you're looking back and you're like, oh, we went from 5 people to 50. I suppose we better, figure out all those things that bigger corporations need. I think when we talk about, just a bunch of people getting in a room saying, I'm going to solve a problem. I don't like the way this is made, or I don't like the way this is done. And you see several organizations like that. I think when you don't stop to think, that's where you get the ultimate cliche of we're like a family here. And because it does feel familial, it is comfortable, it is a bunch of healthy relationships in the beginning, and that's organic for the founders. But that doesn't scale. We've talked about, you use the term family and it's a loaded dice for anybody else who might hear that. But I think that fallback is just sort of natural. Like, oh, this is comfortable. This is like family to me. And I want to keep that spirit alive. And that's a great goal, but you have to put some specific terms, again, family means a lot of things to a lot of people. So what is it about this aspect that feels comfortable, secure, like they're not going anywhere? And those are the questions that you can then start to craft the company culture and things around. And I think that, to your point, maximizing profitability is great. It is, to some degree, capitalism completely off the rails, because we all know that if you look at some of the ripple effects of if you invest in people, they can have an impact on your business 2, 5, 10 years down the road, that you can't draw a straight line between I spent $20 on this certification. That seems a little absurd, but I spent $200 on this certification and then, I got my next CFO.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you very much for that. Rich, let's go to you.
Well, I was just kind of thinking that what Emmy said a little bit ago about like it's not a sign, but I think there are, if we look at Ed Shine's culture model, right? The signs, symbols, behaviors, or the artifacts that demonstrate the espoused values of the organization. So, but the organization exists. It came into being because of one thing: the customer. Right. The customer had a problem. The organization came about because it solved a problem for that customer. How do you future-proof your culture to that is, I think, I don't know if you could really say that you're going to have a static culture because the customer is never static. Right. However, there are signs, symbols, and behavior, and things like there's actually a few different organizations out there. One of them that comes to mind is this one called Gaping Void that I follow, and they've worked with like the Air Force and Fortune 500 companies and stuff like that, right? And they build like a culture wall, which is a bunch of graphics that they put on a wall that has slogans and it shows off the what they're committed to, right? And it's hard to, so when they publish it like that, right? So I think that's a super important part of trying to make sure that your culture is established, is to actually publish the thing. So it's not just out in the ether, right? Like putting those signs, symbols, and behaviors into something that is actually tangible and can be seen by everybody. So those culture walls, I think, are something that is, it goes beyond the kitten hanging on hang in there, those posters. It's not just that, right? It's something that means something and is part of that organization. But I think those things can have a profound effect on, maintaining your culture, as long as it makes sense to maintain that culture. Because again, if the customer's sentiment changes, and we've seen the evolution of companies that have been around for several generations, the sentiment of these, the various decades or whatever, have changed. So the company does, to some extent, have to change their culture to some extent to match what the customer, their whole reason for being there, the changes that they make. Does that make sense? Oh, Tom, sorry, you're muted.
When it comes to changes, let me ask you this, because, like me, you've got kids who are sort of in that transition stage of, about to get into the work world or into the real world. And a lot of people of those ages are going to start their own companies with their own culture. How much has that changed from when we were in our 20s and maybe starting our own business? How has the mindset of that generation that's coming into the workforce now, how is it going to change the culture of organizations?
Oh man,
good question. Huh?
I don't know. I mean, it's so much more sophisticated now than when I was 20. I mean, I didn't have the internet when I was that age, right? So, I had a CD. I had a pager, man. Like that's, I had to remember everybody's phone number in my head, right? I mean, that's how it was. So there was no, connectivity to people like on LinkedIn and all that type of stuff, So, I think then I felt like culture was very, it depended on the people you were co-located with a lot more than today, where today it is, you're going to deal with people who are coast to coast. I mean, we're doing this right now, right? So, I don't know, man. It's a totally different ballgame than when we were kids, and trying to maintain a culture. Like I recently worked with a company that had 6 different locations, a couple in Canada and 4 in the US, and every one of those, even though there's an overall culture, right, there were subcultures within each of those locations based on their geography and their the values within their mesosphere there, right? And then boy, I haven't used that term since college, since grad school, but all of that does get affected, so I think it's a real challenge, man.
Yeah, back when I was young, culture was something you found in a theater or your yogurt. It wasn't something we talked about in the business world. So at least we've advanced that much. Thanks very much, Rich. LindaAnn, let's go back to you.
Wow, you're on fire this morning, Tom. So a couple of points I want to make, and that is, as you go ahead and think about making some of these shifts and formalizing the culture, right? Some of the challenge that happens goes back to the conversation we had about the old guard, right? And even the process of just codifying what you determine to be your culture to be is off-putting to some of the old guard, right? And so that is one challenge that you need to figure is going to happen to some degree. But the importance of doing that is when you're going through the scaling process, you recognize that you're starting to take on that size. Maybe it's around 15, 20, 25 for you, whatever that is, where you can't hold on to, you can't have those tendrils in everything anymore to influence the culture. that's a very unique and fleeting opportunity for an organization at that level. And it can apply in some ways to departments as in larger organizations, but it's without making sure that you're identifying what that culture is and communicating it, and then empowering and um, reinforcing and making the leadership accountable for the maintenance of that culture. And that can happen across country, through different teams, right? But making them accountable for that consistency. And I'm going to use the reference of a franchise again. It's the same process where you're communicating the consistency of what it means to be a member of this organization. That falls to the leadership. It needs to be reiterated by senior, the C-suite and so forth, and expected accountability for that. But that really falls to the managers and leadership to practice that content of the culture to make sure that it stays part of the soul of the company. And to something that you were saying a bit ago, Tom, is that as we move forward in this, you talked about the profitability. Culture is closely tied to employee engagement, right? And when it starts to break, when culture starts to break, people will look for what can we do to fix this, right? Things are breaking down, people are unhappy, we have turnover, all those kinds of things. And sometimes they look at the culture, right? They say, oh, well, we need to revisit how people approach work and all those kinds of things, and want to do a culture renovation. But that doesn't happen just by coming up with a new culture statement. And that's one of the things I call a Band-Aid. I worked with a group of consultants one time, and one of our unifying factors was no Band-Aids allowed. We were not going to go and work with a company and institute Band-Aids to fix something. So when you look at the opportunity, if you miss this opportunity to create that communication process for what our culture really is and reinforce it, as things break down in the future, it's going to take working from the inside out. You're going to have to go down to the trenches and figure out what's broken in those levels that's creating that dissent and that lack of culture that you want, and fix it in process, versus if you go through the communication process at at this level, the early part, and make sure you maintain that thread that supports your values and all those kinds of things. It's going to take a lot more on the backside in 2, 5, 10 years, whatever.
Keeps coming back to communication. Thank you for that. Lee, let's go to you.
Yeah, it's just a fact of life that the majority of small businesses fail. I don't remember the percentage, but it's been fairly consistent that the majority of them fail. And a lot of times the failure is when they attempt to scale. When we talk culture, a lot of people have no idea. I mean, what does culture mean? Like you said, is it in the movie theater? Are we watching indie films? But you got kind of two options. You two roads you can go down. You've got accidental culture and you have intentional culture. Because if to use the old cliche, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And if you don't define it, that doesn't mean you don't have a culture. That just means you get what you get. That's an accidental, because culture is going to happen anyway. Anytime you get a group of people together, a culture will develop. And it's just the nature of people and groups. But if you're intentional about it, and you need to start that early, you need to start that when it is the group of buddies around the kitchen table. You need to start thinking about what Okay, we've got a great idea. We've got a better mousetrap. Okay, all that's great. We want to make $1 million. Okay, sweet, cool. But why are we doing this? And is it because I want $1 million in the bank? Okay, well, that's one motivation. Or is it, I think that things will be better with this better mousetrap? And so as you really think through your why, because the why is very important. Why are you doing what you're doing? And that's the communication. You talk about communication between your employees who are gonna buy in and your customers. If you can define the why as an organization, you do what you do, people will connect to that. And some companies are much better at it than others. I mean, two prime examples. Think about Apple and Microsoft. Microsoft has never had, that I'm aware of, someone tattoo the window thing on their arm. Apple has. But there's a difference in the way that they communicate why they do what they do, and they reach out to that particular. I mean, a Mac's a good computer, but it's expensive, and a lot of people, there's a reason that they spend that extra money to get that when it's going to cost them 2-3 times more than they can get a different computer. And a lot of that is just because of, they want to be part of that. My wife's got the iPhone, the iPad, I call it the Apple cult. You get sucked into iTunes, you're never going to escape. But there are people that's their thing, and you look at, just using that example, you look at the between like some Android products and some of the Microsoft products. I mean, they're much more feature rich than a lot of your iPhones and whatever else, but that doesn't matter because people are bought into that culture. And, Steve Jobs was very intentional about that. He had a why he was doing what he was doing. And, they didn't focus on the competition. They focused on what they were doing and their customers. The competition was going to take care of themselves. And that's really a lot of what it is. I mean, you got to know what's going on around you, blah, blah, blah. It's like when you're driving, you got to pay attention to the other cars. But, but when it comes down to it, you can't pay so much attention to that you forget to steer.
Yeah, you're right. I remember the debates we used to have in post-secondary where the science instructors and the business instructors, they all wanted PCs. But everybody in the arts, we were like, no, we're creatives. We need Apple.
Yeah.
And we got our Apples and they got their PCs. So there you go. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Emmy, back to you.
So one of the things I often talk to my teams about is the question of what's more important. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the thing that's not more important isn't important at all. So my context in my sphere, we do a lot of work in agile frameworks. And one of the things in the Agile Manifesto states individuals and interactions over processes and tools, but processes and tools are extremely important as well. But if in a specific scenario or when we're trying to make decisions, we need to consider what's more important. We focus on individuals and interactions, and then also, subsequently then processes and tools. Now, I give that as an example because LindaAnn mentioned communicating and empowering the maintenance of the culture or the purpose of what you're trying to do when you're scaling there. And one of the strategies I use in this setting and in this context is the story behind the purpose. So Rich mentioned, artifacts and them being important, and that's certainly very, very true because although I, say, hey, this isn't just a poster on the wall, I think personally, faith is extremely central to my life, and I have plenty of artifacts, crosses on like every one of my walls. And so, that's something that's a guiding purpose, but there's a story behind that artifact, right? There is a something meaningful to me that I connect with in that artifact when I look at that cross on the wall, that's connected to me as an individual, right? And so I think when we use strategies like stories, that can really empower the purpose or that scaling or that maintenance that LindaAnn was talking about. So when a company vision will find power in that story. So that's, I think, kind of connected to what Lee was saying there. What's the why, right? So why are we doing this? What's the story behind the why that we're doing this? And you can really align the hearts and the minds of your resources within the organization if they are connected to the story behind that. So the vision without a story is really just a statement, right? It is a statement that nobody connects to necessarily, or may not find connection to if there isn't something that anchors them, that's compelling them to get behind that mission or that vision or that purpose. And so I love the concept of storytelling. I think leaders who become good storytellers become people who connect their resources and even their customers to the vision that they've got and the purpose. And what is the purpose of the scaling? They can connect their customers to that evolution that they're making there. And it really transforms that purpose into a shared narrative that people are rallying behind, that they are going to want to grow with and evolve with and contribute to, for that matter, because the people within your organization are the contributors to that next evolution too. So your customers and your people, which is those interactions and with individuals that I mentioned about processes and tools in the Agile framework. If you're connecting to the individuals who are out there creating the output for the purpose, storytelling is a really compelling way. And it's not easy to be a storyteller. I think, Tom, you probably understand that as an actor. I mean, you're telling a story on the stage, right? And sharing a story that people connect to and get engaged in and want to hear the outcome of in that setting. So that is a really amazing skill set to start practicing, and that leaders can master to help really bring people into the fold of any changes that you're making as you're getting bigger.
I'd love to do a survey and see how many employees and companies actually know the vision statement of their organization, because it's often something, we make them up, we think they're great, and then we file them somewhere. Let me ask you this though, and I'm not sure if we can go down this little path here, but I'm wondering about toxic cultures. Like, if you need to shift your culture because it's toxic, how hard is that? Like, I'm thinking, boy, if I've got a bunch of guys working in the warehouse and that culture is toxic, how do I even begin?
Yeah, absolutely. So the answer, I think, is yes. It's very hard, right? But how do you eat an elephant, right? It's one bite at a time, and in incremental chunks. And I think about this joint venture between GM and Toyota. And there's a podcast out there in the world. I think I've talked about it here before. What GM was going through in this particular plant outlined in that podcast is a culture change. They had a really toxic culture. Some of the things happening in this plant were not only producing a poor quality product on the production line, but they were also really impacting negatively the workers that were then ultimately producing a poor quality product, right? And so what they did was they went to Toyota. They learned the Toyota way, if you will, of their production line. And at the end of the day, the core part of the change there was shifting the culture mentality to one of quality, but also of the people who produce the quality. And so I really love, actually, when I form a new team, I have them listen to this podcast first before we start any training, because it speaks to the teaming element, and it speaks to how they're going to work together, and making sure that at the onset, the expectation is set that the team is going to deliver as a team. And what does that even mean? And it gives a really good illustration of that. Now, ultimately, very sadly, GM did not take these learnings and scale them. So you can also hear about their failure. I'll use that word in that sense there, because they did not take it to the next level and then continue to empower that culture to be maintained. But it's a brilliant story about how they really learned from Toyota in this joint venture, and how they were able to produce an outcome based on the culture and the teaming aspect, and then ultimately then the quality that Toyota is really known for on the production lines.
Which once again highlights why you need to hire one of these really brilliant people to come in and work in your organization to scale for success. Thank you very much, Paul. Always good to see you. Let's go to you.
Tom, that was an interesting comment you made about isn't just making money the purpose. So I would call that as a survival purpose, sort of very foundational. Every company, if you don't bring in more money than you spend, you won't survive. But how you go about that is the culture. and that gets back to basically behavior. And so, from LindaAnn's point, you need to define the purpose. So what are the behavior patterns that you want to reinforce? Like, what's okay in terms of treating each other? What's not okay? And that's where you start to focus. So if you want to be very innovative, then you have to encourage people to innovate. And you reward innovation, and you might even reward failure. And so you say, that's what we're about. If you could go the other way and say, we don't like taking risks, we don't want people innovating, and so they're encouraged not to do that. And that becomes an important piece of the culture. It could be customer service, it could be safety, it could be a lot of different things. It can be just in how we treat each other. How do we talk to each other? How do we treat each other? And again, companies have, you think about what are the critical factors, the critical things that you want to reinforce and you want to continue on and scale up. You can't reinforce everything. You have to pick what's the important elements and focus there. And as other people are saying, it's about leadership coming from the top. It's about messaging, stories, all of those things. But it really begins with isolating what are the important things that you want to reinforce, and what do you want to what would you say, anti-reinforce, get them to die out.
Well, let me ask you this, because I hope I'm wrong in this. I really do. And I love what you're saying, but when I look at the really big corporations that are out there, the Googles, the Amazons, the Teslas, I don't perceive them as companies with great culture. They when I hear about them in the news, it's not looking good as far as their culture goes. But those are the images out there that we're all told that if we want to be successful, that's the image we should be pursuing. But it doesn't sound to me that that's really going to be effective, although it seems to be working for them. So what am I missing there?
It's really hard, particularly if you're talking about multinationals, where there's an culture that's, maybe in collision from one place to another. So, and, if you have an American company and you think certain management styles are what are important, but they may not be effective elsewhere. So there are some things that you can reinforce that you may be successful in pretty much getting adopted throughout a huge company, and some things that you're going to have to be flexible on and adapt to. And so in that case, you have to worry about how things are received and local customs and those sorts of things.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I remember 20 years ago having discussions with people about if you're talking to someone, in the business profession from Japan, for example, and they won't make eye contact with you. And so you keep staring them in the eyes, not realizing that it's, with their culture. So are we getting much more sensitive as we become more global with other cultures?
You would hope so.
Yeah.
I assume people have become much more sensitive, particularly in multinationals where they've gotten a lot of experience. And if you're going overseas on some assignment, hopefully they've given you some briefing about, okay, they don't make eye contact, don't get too worried about it, and talking about what are the important things. But the fundamental stuff is where you really need to be concerned. Like, for example, if you're a high-tech company and innovation is really important, then maybe that will work. Maybe different flavors of it, but maybe that would work pretty much anywhere.
Well, thank you very much for that. Nick, let's go over to you.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to kind of circle back on. We talk about the internet as a tool, going from a pager to, the Library of Alexandria in your pocket, all that. I think that kind of speaks to seeing the examples. You talk about the Amazons and the Apples and the heavy hitters of the world, and everybody can see that example like a lighthouse from shore and all of that. And so you think, well, that's the one way to be successful. There's one way to do it. I'm gonna just do what they did. But the beauty of it all is there's no limit on the amount of ways you can be successful. And some of that can also be, I am going to react to some of that soulless corporation, and I'm going to keep people at the center of what I do. And so I think that the vehicles are there and they're easy to see, and we can see these paths of social media influencers and TikTok stars, and the busker who was found on the corner and now is selling out stadiums and things like that. So there's all these stories, and the more of these sort of paths we see, the more options there are to get there. And it's wild to see how things are going. But I think that no matter the tool or the vehicle, there are some fundamental things we keep coming back to. It's communication, it's strategy, it's being deliberate and saying, this is what I want the culture to be. And even examining, I will say sometimes that culture is personality at scale when we're talking about this. You take the founder and you try to get those same things to happen when they're not in the room. I think that's that deliberate strategy, and I think there is kind of the dark side of that. Maybe the CEO originally, their language was a little too blue, and all of a sudden we need to clean it up for a family audience and things like that. That's a culture shift that they're not going to see because they're used to saying whatever they're saying in the development, and then have to change that as the situation changes. And I think there is a certain level of you can control what you can control, but the fact that you are scaling and change is happening to you already, if you don't know what the central parts of the culture that you're trying to preserve are, it's gonna run over you, or your warts and all are going to be exposed, and those are going to be the things that people notice about you first.
Well, now I want to buy Amazon and put an IO psychologist in charge and see how things change. I think that would be really neat. Thank you very much for that. Christine, let's go to you.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Y'all, this is such a topic that I'm so passionate about. I can't even get the words out. I'm so passionate. So first, Tom, you mentioned maybe we should just hire IO psychologists. I'm going to say toxic culture gives us all job security. So I'm fine with that. However, having said that, there is the conversation I want to circle back to about culture and its impact on profitability. I'll never forget the time that I was in graduate school studying to get my master's in IO. And one of my professors said, I challenge you to look at the New York Stock Exchange and the top 10 companies that are constantly year over year profitable have a positive, engaging culture. And he was like, you can bet your money and put your money in those stocks because it's going to pay you back in bold. And one of the conversations I recently just had with my husband was around the Boeing culture. So, sorry, I don't know if we're allowed to call out companies, but I'm just going to go ahead and do that here.
I do it all the time.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to call out Boeing because in the 90s, when in their inception and the purpose of their finding was to be the best aerospace company, building the best airplanes out there. And they spent so much money, they fed so much of their profits back into research and development. When they made the choice to sell to venture capitalists in the 90s, profit became their number one focus. They started to cut corners. They stopped becoming an engineering company and became a finance company. And we all know the current state of their aircrafts, right? I personally do everything to avoid taking a Boeing when I'm flying. So that to me, these are cultures. You talked earlier, Lee talked earlier about Apple. Cultures that permeate outside of the walls of the business into society are the cultures that we really should think about, that we should really study and look at. Like, what makes somebody put an Apple tattoo on their person while completely burning Teslas because you're mad at you're mad at the CEO of the business. Do you know what I mean? These are cultures that permeate, that make a massive impact on profitability. And the conversation I was having with my husband about Boeing was when Boeing was before the grand jury talking about the 2017 aircrafts that kind of fell out of the sky. There were two of them. And the conversation that I was having with my husband is I told him, listen, if they had a better culture, the CEO would never have been in front of the grand jury to begin with. Like when you treat your people poorly, that's what happens. Like these are the things that end up happening. And I have kind of been on a soapbox a little bit that Boeing doesn't have an engineering problem. They have a culture problem. So I took ferocious notes and I feel like I kind of grabbed all of that. But those are my ideas around culture. I really believe culture, when it permeates into society, it does have a direct impact to your profit margins.
Yeah, there's an interesting book out there called Speak Up Culture, and they profile Boeing and how they shut down communication once again. And so the left hand was not talking to the right, and planes fell out of the sky.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for that, LindaAnn. Back to you.
Just to start with some of the things that Christine had mentioned, when you talk about culture like that, one of the things is in Apple, Steve Jobs had people that were designated to call him out, right? As far as that they were there to do, because he would come up with these ideas and they were designated people to push back and say, no, that's not going to work here. You need to do this instead, because you need to have that kind of a check in how things are going and get that constant grounding and staying in touch with where your people are so that those communications are aligned. Again, it's about the alignment of the communication and communicating expectations. We all can deal with change and process if we have expectations identified ahead of time, right? Mm-hmm. So if you know that you have to leave in 10 minutes, you say to everybody, we're leaving in 10 minutes. Remember, close up the stuff instead of saying, we're leaving now, right? So you need to have those expectations. And that's part of what culture does. When you have it define the behaviors that you expect from people, instead of, my one client, he clearly put into, part of the culture statement is, culture is not a ping pong table. And so many companies think that, we're going to just have more coffee and the ping pong table will bring lunch in and everybody should be really happy and productive. And that's just, those I always say is, that's icing on the cake. But your culture and engagement is a result. It's not a thing you can do. It's the result of all the other behaviors. And clearly with that, when you talk about profitability, one of the things, I've been in a couple of organizations where they were growing and people were, why are we just worried about growing? And, are we growing for growth's sake? And we're just growing for money. But that's not why you're growing in most cases, right? In this particular case, when you grow, you have the opportunity. Now you've grown to where you have better credibility. You have more respect in the industry. And now you can get those better projects, those projects that people want to work on instead of the little tiny things that just kept the door open. So there's always a purpose behind the growth. Very rarely is it just because we want to line somebody's pockets, at least in this day and age.
How much does culture come in line with empowering your employees?
Well, you have to empower your employees. Otherwise, you can't grow. Actually, you end up constrained, right? If you're micromanaging and holding on so tight for whatever reason, you're not going to be able to grow, right? It's going to be paralyzing for the organization, and then you're going to start your turnover, and you're not going to be able to grow because you'll have churn. It's a downward spiral that you go through. So empowerment is critical, along with the psychological safety of trust. Right? You can't empower without the trust.
We've often talked about, change has to start at the top if it's going to be successful, but we also talk about mid-management and how they're often, the gatekeepers, and they've got to be involved as well, because if they're not on board, things don't go anywhere. And so I'm wondering how much of the culture shift, while we need approval, maybe it's got to come from leadership, but what is that role of what I would call the frontline managers who, may be more comfortable with managing projects than leading people? How do they adapt to improve culture?
They are the ambassadors of your culture.
Okay.
Right? They're the ones that when they make decisions or they're working with those teams on the front lines, they're utilizing whatever the content of the culture statement and your vision statement and your values, all of that together is how they are you expect them and teach them to work with their teams. And when they make decisions, like right now, when I work with a company, especially if there's quality or whatever, every decision comes back to these pieces. Okay. If you're like worried about deadlines, well, are you worried about meeting their deadline, or does it matter more that they get that quality because that reflects on you, and then they're going to be happier in the long run? So you have to come back to that almost on a daily basis. How are we making decisions that reflect back and align with those core pieces of the organization? And those are the artifacts and the rituals and the stories that make the continuity happen.
Well, I hope all those big companies are listening. Thank you very much for that, Nick. Let's go to you.
Yeah, you talk about does the culture have to empower the employees? I think we've seen an increase in engagement, and you see the whispering headlines about quiet quitting, and we're at a shift in the economy where it's not how many automobiles can we roll off the production line. You have people changing to subscription models and trying to stay relevant and stay in the popular attention of consumers. And so I think that there is a general culture shift. I hesitate to say that it's because the younger generations are entering the workforce, but I mean sociologically that's part of it. The reactions of what's been happening the last 20 years are coming home to roost. So you take the fact that we have increased productivity with all these new tools and everything that can happen. And quite frankly, I can, find a well-paying job in this industry or this industry. And if you're going to compete for talent, which I know is not necessarily the mode of the day, but it's going to come back, I think most people are going to take the company that says, I value you as a person and what you can do for us today, tomorrow, and the next year, versus, hey, I'm going to give you a salary and you should be grateful. That's, two extremes of that. But I think as the culture at large shifts, the value of what work is and what work does is going to shift. And I think that, you're going to see more people, not be able to be that soulless corporation, because eventually, yes, there's always going to be somebody who's desperate enough to go into the bad situation. But sooner or later, hopefully with, an abundance of resources and all that, people won't have to be that desperate, and we can, shift those behaviors and attitudes out. When was the last time you saw somebody light up a cigarette on the street corner? I mean, yes, now it's the vape and all of that, but these changes can and do happen based on what we know and how we behave.
Well, I hope you're right on that. Dr. Emmy, back to you.
I often like to think about things on a scale, and I've mentioned that here before. And so I want to kind of touch on your question there, Tom, from what it looks like when you're not empowered, right? And what does being disempowered in an organization look like? And if you are not empowering people to carry out that purpose, whether it's the purpose behind a scaling or any other purpose, then it just becomes performative for the employees at that point. And without empowerment, then that purpose, those artifacts, those things, they just stay on the wall. There's no roots to help you align to for your daily decision making. And then ultimately, then there becomes a disconnect, disengagement, dilution of the culture and the impact that you're having in your industry or in your mission that you're trying to carry out, even if it is also profit, right? Like that's definitely a part of a lot of organizations. If you're a for-profit organization, that is a part of that, but you're really then diluting the impact that individuals can have towards those ultimate purposes. And if they're not empowered to carry out the purpose, and your promise becomes unfulfilled to the employees, to the customer, to the community, right? And then that leads to misalignment and mistrust and mission drift. And as the company scales, especially, that's going to be kind of the other side of that scale. So I think we often talk about, if you do this, then this positive outcome will come. I think it's really important for leaders to understand the other side of scale. If I don't do this, then what does that look like? And, Nick mentioned there people being disengaged, quiet quitting, those kinds of things, I think it's important to understand the full scale of the impact of not empowering people, because that is something that even personally I've seen is probably one of the biggest challenges in the teams that I face, is the individual contributors and the middle management not receiving the appropriate level of empowerment to carry out the purpose that they're being asked to have.
Let me ask you really quickly, because I've been through a lot of training in my years, and it's usually one-offs where they hire someone to come in and they do an hour and a half presentation, and then management goes, "Okay, problem solved." Um, how much of this is just a process that we need to start and we need to continue? So if we're going to shift the culture, it's not going to be an overnight thing. This is something that not only is going to take 6 months, a year, but we need to stay observant of our culture. So are we getting to the point now where maybe it's a shift in HR? Maybe their role is going to change, but do we need cultural advocates in our organization?
Well, I think definitely yes. But the other element of that is measuring the change, right? What was the intention of, in your example, the training? So understanding where we are and the baseline, understanding the impact we intend to have, and then going back afterward and measuring. And that might be someone that is the cultural advocate that kind of stays over these next 6 months, making sure that we keep mentioning what that purpose of that training was, or what the purpose of the learning was in that particular context for the organization. But then going back and seeing, okay, did it deliver an impact? And that's something that organizations are notoriously bad at doing, is going back and seeing if the intended impact has been made. And if not, what else do we need to do? It's not a one-time thing, even if it is a training. You want to go back afterward, whether it's in 6 weeks or 6 weeks and 6 months, and see, has this training, has this education or learning truly made an impact? And is there a champion that's helping throughout that time to make sure that it's sticky? The stickiness of whatever you're learning is very vital, and it can be done with individuals, and it can also be done with measurement over time.
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Amanda Ray, let's go to you.
Sorry, I lost my mute button. I think the phone's telling me something. So LindaAnn ended up mentioning something a little earlier about the no Band-Aids. And this is also where I think that our higher educational system and our programs probably do not prepare IOs for the workplace, where there is, what Band-Aids can we use in order to build up that clientele without weighing the benefits of the credibility that can hit for folks, because it just further fuels that, hey, yeah, we'll come in and we'll fix it. We have a magic training wand. When you consider and I see you laughing at that, Linda, my way have one that has low battery power for a reason. So when I smack it, it flickers and then it goes out. But when it comes to learning and development, people have got to understand that the 70-20-10 rule or guideline, 10% of it is really the foundational training. 20% of it is social, meaning, are you having the discussions? Are you bringing it back into the workplace for those coaching opportunities? And 70% is application. Are you going to touch it within 2 to 3 days and have that direct application? If you don't have that set up in play, that is a point in which we as consultants need to say no. If you are not ready to step up to the game and hold that portion of the ownership, then we're not going to hurt ourselves and our own credibility in giving those Band-Aids. And that's kind of where I've gotten in my career, is that if there is not a certain level of buy-in and ownership to follow through, where the leader is taking on that ownership to do that 70% and that 20% within the workplace, after that 10% rah, here's a learning and development opportunity, then my time and everybody's time collectively that was there was wasted.
I think we might need a new podcast, Tough Talk for Business with Dr. Amanda Ray, because I like that a lot. They have to step up to the plate, and if you're doing it to check a box, there's no value in that.
Absolutely. And our higher ed education needs to build that into the needs analysis. because I don't recall in any program and anybody that has ever gone through any programs ever taught folks that if you don't have buy-in, that is the time to say no. I do not remember any program instituting that. And that is a critical gap that exists from academics into actually putting it into practice that a lot of folks only can learn the hard way.
Yeah, same thing in acting training where they teach you to be an actor, but they don't really teach you how to be an actor in the real world. They're not sharing those life experiences with you that you've got to discover on your own. So I think post-secondary, we need more training on the reality of what life is like for IO psychologists, for actors, and for a number of people in the real profession. So thank you very much for that. LindaAnn, back to you.
So very quickly, just to carry on what Christine was saying and to comment also on points Emmy made, and that's especially as far as Band-Aids, often companies will go ahead and not take the time to identify the actual cause of the problem. And I would say a very large percent of the actions companies take don't end up giving them the result that they're looking for. And then they get frustrated and they've wasted all this money and they just give up or let it slide away and they never follow up on it. And so it's really critically important to understand really what you're trying to fix and is that the right cause of the problem that you're trying to address, because otherwise there's a lot of money wasted and no result.
And there you go. Thank you very much for that, and thank you for leading us this month. It's been a great month, lots of great discussion. I'm assuming you're not continuing next week. We're going to have a new topic next month.
Well, next week is still July.
Oh. Okay, I'll be back in 2 weeks. No. Do we have a topic for next week?
We do. And because when I submitted my topics initially, Jeremy said, "Oh yeah, we have 5 this month." So, but what I thought would be fun as a culmination of this month is to have an open discussion of the Netflix culture deck, and it's a classic document, and it was established, I think, originally in the early 2000s. And it's 124 slides, no formatting. And it was meant to be read, not done in a slideshow. And they were under 300 people when they did this particular culture deck that describes their culture and what they expected in behaviors and all those kinds of things. And I remember reading it and going, man, I don't know that's going to work for a larger company. I don't know about some of this stuff. Some of it's great, but as far as scaling, I don't know. And so if you go today, there's 4 tenets of their culture right now, and there are over 14,000 people. So I think that we could have a lot of fun discussion of looking at that culture deck and saying, okay, why didn't this scale, or why is this not a good idea to start? And I think that it could be a very engaging, fruitful conversation.
I would love to have someone from their C-suite join us for that discussion. Maybe they'll get some useful advice. So thank you very much for that. And thank you everyone for your contribution today. And once again, join us every week, Thursday, 12 a.m. Eastern. Just go over to the CBOC website to get your invitation. It's absolutely free. And we'd love to hear you on the podcast. So LindaAnn, thank you once again. Go ahead. You look like you were going to say something.
I did, because I have an announcement from Jeremy for August. August is IO Awareness Month.
Right.
And this will be available in August. So he said, well, it's not quite August yet. This episode will be aired in August. And so in 2023, CBOC declared August IO Psychology Awareness Month, and to celebrate, they're offering a 30% discount off of the IO Career Accelerated course for the entire month. And for listeners of the podcast, use the code AWARE32. That's an extra 2% to make it 32% off, and that helps us track the course enrollments coming from the podcast. So go ahead. If you have any inclination to take that course, now's a really good time to do it, because you have a 32% discount.
And you can always, with the C Box, you can get in touch with one of the mentors and you can have a half-hour conversation with us for absolutely free. So there's lots of opportunities. And once again, you're absolutely right. IO Psychology Awareness Month is coming up in a little over a week. Once we hit August. So thank you very much for that reminder, LindaAnn. And we'll see everyone back here in 1 week's time. If you'd like to count us out.
3, 2, 1. Thanks, everybody.